go ahead.
All right. Well, thank you for taking the time to meet with me today. And you are a member of the Decriminalize Nature DC organization. So, if you could just tell us a little bit about that first, and what you do and what your mission is.
Yeah, of course. Well, I think one of the very cool things about Decriminalize Nature DC is that it is a grassroots, adaptable organization. And I think my various roles and the way I got involved kind of illustrates that. So I can just run you through how I got connected.
Mm.
So I just saw social media posts about Decriminalize Nature DC. And I had just finished reading Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind.
Right.
And to be honest, I was mostly just shocked that there was any sort of political movement around or instigated by psychedelic research.
Mm-hmm.
It just seemed so quick, not in a safety sense. I think the evidence is really clear, and we spent 50 years just pretending it wasn't there. And
Right.
luckily, we're now back into critical examination of these substances. But I was just so surprised, given the depth of war on drugs propaganda and mindset that it dominated. And let's be honest, how recently we've started to re-examine that. I was shocked that there was any kind of political movement around it. And the more I dug on social media, there were decriminalized nature campaigns popping up all over the country, already jurisdictions on the West Coast and in Colorado. And more recently now, Ann Arbor, Michigan have decriminalized.
Right. I did hear about that.
Very exciting. So I was just blown away that anything was happening politically, and I was not, not using these substances, and I was not active on any campaigns because I had been in campaign finance and I don't want money in politics, so that was draining.
Right.
So I'd moved away. So I kind of thought, okay, this is a cool way to take these two interests, having read this book, and being politically involved, and jump in. So I started volunteering. Initially, the campaign was mostly formed around committees, or working groups, which were volunteer led and run. So I joined the events and education working group. So I was with a group of volunteers that were meeting once a week to try to plan out the events we would have, both educational panels and, like a gala and, a silent auction, like ways to raise money, ways to raise awareness, ways to get our volunteers involved. Sorry, we have an angsty cat over here.
It's
He feels
okay.
very strongly about the war on drugs. So I was just volunteering once a week in this group. And gradually I started going to more kind of leadership meetings and just kind of getting involved with things that weren't events and education. And, it's just kind of vague. And I was just working on various projects with various people, getting to know more of the groups that were constituting this campaign. And I guess I just started doing more field work. And I was familiar with it's kind of a CRM software. It's called NGP Van. A lot of Democratic campaigns especially use it, though we are not one. And I was familiar with that from past work. So they had me start helping out with phone banking, getting volunteers to call voters and that whole system. And I got put on payroll for various roles. And I've just been jumping around and doing different things for the campaign since. So we got it on the ballot back then, and the campaign kind of went dark for a little bit. And I was doing a little bit of field work, registering voters who had tried to sign the petition, but whose signatures weren't counted. I was following up to make sure they were registered to see if there was another error. And now I'm back to kind of running the software stuff and getting volunteers to phone bank, and just doing various other things. I think I mentioned to you, or you saw, I did an educational panel on entheogens in the environment. So just various things like that. So yeah, I would say I've especially enjoyed kind of having my hands in different pots and seeing different aspects of it, because so much of this is different groups of volunteers and dedicated people kind of taking the initiative. And I really like how decentralized and grassroots that is.
Yeah.
I guess I'll end the word vomit and let you redirect this.
Well, no, I mean, thank you. I mean, from what I get from that is, it's very community based. It's very, rooted in, what people in the DC community want. And so far, I mean, that seems like that's been the case in every city that's decriminalized or made any movement for it. And likewise, I didn't know that there was a political movement behind it in my area until probably about 6 months ago. And I had in college, I had tried mushrooms once or twice, and found that it does help with certain aspects of depression. And I've read a lot of the research, and it's very convincing. And so I really wanted to get behind it. I wanted to be one of the people going door to door getting signatures, but then the pandemic hit, so that kind of, fell through. But
And I should have flagged the pandemic definitely was maybe the defining aspect of this campaign. As I said, I was planning all these events,
right,
and
right,
then the pandemic hit, and we just had to cancel everything we
yeah,
had planned, try to convert it to virtual. That's when the phone bank and a lot of the data stuff became more important because we were just planning on flooding the streets with volunteers.
yeah,
But suddenly we had, honestly, we had to buy a lot of momentum just because most campaigns around the country, ballot initiative campaigns, just had to shut down.
yeah.
Luckily, we had donors who were willing to pitch in to make it feasible to
Hmm.
send the ballots to hundreds of thousands of DC residents. Essentially, we lobbied the election board and the uh, essentially sign for themselves. Like when you're out there getting signatures, you get signatures and then you sign that you got them. We got to change so people could sign their signature and sign for themselves so they could sign at home. It's still too many hurdles to leap through for democracy, but it was doable. And as I said, luckily we were able to fund an effort to mail these to hundreds of thousands of DC voters and get those sent back and get it across the finish line. But that was
Yeah.
definitely difficult due to the pandemic and not what we were expecting.
Yeah, I
Um,
remember the day I got my signature request in the mail. It was, it was great. It was a great feeling, feeling like I was, actually doing something, affecting change in my community. It's a really great
and
feeling.
it's and it's so cool just that this is not a bunch of legislators
Yeah.
doing anything. This is a DC resident, someone who's not in the psychedelic community, a mother of two, a DC government employee who had this experience healing from postpartum depression and decided that she wanted to make a change happen.
Hmm.
And then got a bunch of us around her, and just as a group, we were able to do that. And it's very cool to just be part of direct democracy in that kind of way.
Hmm.
And DC is very lucky to be one of the not states, but one of the jurisdictions of the United States where you can have direct democracy, not just a referendum, but
Right.
you can have a ballot initiative,
Yeah.
which, yeah, as you said, is a very cool feeling.
Yeah, it's really great. I also remember back in, I think it was 2014, when Initiative 71 was on the ballot, which decriminalized cannabis. That was also a momentous moment. I was too young at the time to vote. I think I was 17, so it was kind of just before I was able to vote on it. But it was still really big news in the community. I mean, everyone in my high school was talking about it. Everyone, my dad was up in arms about it. Of course, he's a little bit more traditional in his ways. Um, um,
They
but
are. It's been a blast. A lot of people who were involved. I wasn't in the district at the time, so I followed headlines, but didn't have any personal connections. It's been a blast to get to know veterans of the 71 campaign.
yeah.
A lot of them are working on Initiative 81, obviously, and they are just lovely people.
Mm,
Yeah, I want to flag the coalition. We can get into this, but the mix of people, because you hear what the initiative is, and a lot of people who aren't so familiar think it's going to be a bunch of hippies, but you have this incredible cross section from the Initiative 71 kind of hippie stoner types to these like clean cut lawyers who represent underground psychedelic therapists, to the moms who discovered microdosing in their 50s as a solution to, say, their depression, to the veterans. It's just such a cross section. You've got the young, put together, white collar millennial workers. You've got, I don't know, it's just all kinds of people,
yeah.
which is really great. Um,
Yeah, it really
yeah,
just
but
bridges that generational divide. All over the board. Even in DC, I've also seen that it's had a great effect on bridging the racial divide in DC as well. It's brought a lot of communities together that on different sides of the city that necessarily wouldn't necessarily get together on a subject like this. And it's really great that that's been a community-led effort up to this point, and I hope it goes further. I mean, if it passes, that's great, and I hope people in DC do something with it. And in that regard, what do you think about people growing like psychedelic plant medicines for themselves? Like, do you think if it does pass, will people in DC, really take that movement and run with it, or will they, sort of just mill around with it for a while and not really do anything with it?
Yeah, well, before really directly answering the question, I want to give a little bit of context, which connects to Initiative 71, which you were mentioning, and to DC's special status. So since DC is not a state and is not enfranchised, legislators from those states which get to elect legislators, which is all of them, because we're not one of them, they control us through the budget process. They approve DC's budget, and they can put irrelevant writers to control our behavior because we are not enfranchised. I just really want to bring that home. So after DC decriminalized cannabis, the plan, my understanding is, again, I was not part of this process, my understanding is DC and the council were going to formally legalize, regulate, tax, product safety, consumer safety, all of that with cannabis. What you want to see, what Colorado is doing in California.
And with dispensaries as well. I heard that was the plan.
Yeah, so unfortunately, a congressman from the great state of Maryland,
Andy Harris,
attached a rider to our budget, which prevented us from doing that. Mm-hmm. So instead of regulating and funding and all of this great stuff, consumer safety would be nice.
Right.
We have this gray market where you're like, hey, can I buy a brownie? And they're like, a sticker is $60, and it's all vague, and they have to deal entirely in cash, which makes them targets for crime. It's just so many issues with it. So it's great that we address the criminal justice concern. There's a lot more we want to do. Because of that rider, the Harris rider, the Decriminalize Nature campaign is not only not legalizing these substances, we aren't even technically decriminalizing it. I don't think our name is disingenuous. We're part of the Decriminalize Nature network. We want to make sure that these substances people are not going into jail for using them to heal, but we are not actually even decriminalizing them because DC is not allowed to. We're not allowed to make adult decisions for ourselves. Andy Harris has decided. So instead, we are lowering police priorities for these substances, telling police that if somebody's healing with a plant medicine, that's not a priority for arrest. You should just let them heal. Right. And simultaneously calling on the DC Attorney General and the U.S. Attorney General for DC to not prosecute these cases. So with that out of the way, just being very clear that our campaign is specifically addressing the criminal justice concern here, because that is the only thing we are even allowed to address. And due to that, the Decriminalize Nature campaign is not making any predictions or recommendations for how DC proceed after the hopeful passage of Initiative 81. It's incredibly important, and there are a lot of things to consider, which I'm happy to speak to in my personal capacity. I just want to make sure to be clear that the campaign is about lowering police priorities and making sure people are not being arrested and prosecuted, not figuring out what the next steps are for integration into our society.
Right.
Personally, I think it's a fascinating question. I think the FDA just approved psilocybin as a breakthrough therapy for treatment-resistant depression.
Right, I remember.
Or at least fast-tracked it, which is fascinating. So there is some kind of access possibly coming down the pipeline, but we don't know what that access will look like. We don't know if pharmaceutical companies will be patenting the chemicals that grow naturally in these plants and fungi. We don't know, what kind of qualification you will need to give treatment or receive treatment. We don't know. So in the meantime, I think what's important is when these, take psilocybin mushrooms, when these are growing freely in the backyards of residents all across the district, if a resident has a PTSD and could potentially cure their problems with a single bite of this mushroom that grows in their backyard, they could legally eat a poisonous mushroom and commit suicide. But the mushroom which could remove their suicidality is illegal for them to pick. So I think the first step is just fixing that and making sure
Right.
that people
And
can
in that
use.
regard, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to emphasize that eating any mushrooms in your backyard that are growing that you don't absolutely know is a bad idea. If you don't know
Yes,
what it
and
is,
sorry, I
terrible
should be very
idea.
clear about that. That no one should try to identify any kind of mushroom, edible, psychedelic, poisonous, ever on their own without a trained mycologist. It is not a good idea. I'm getting interested in mushroom foraging. I do not go out there and play with it. I wait until someone who can
I
actually
do,
show
but
me.
I stay away from anything that I don't absolutely know what it is.
Hmm.
Yesterday, actually, my friend showed me where she found some lion's mane growing, which I
Very
had
cool,
growing in my grow tent next to me right here. So I
fantastic.
know exactly what it is. I know what it looks like. That I'm comfortable, taking,
Hmm.
a sample of. But if it's anything that's vague in my mind or any kind of doubt, I leave it. I don't touch it. I just let it be.
And worth mentioning is a lot of psilocybin mushrooms. It's not a single species. There are a lot. Are
Right.
little brown mushrooms vague and hard to
Yeah. Yeah.
identify?
Exactly.
So,
It's really
and
tricky.
again, both the campaign and me personally are not encouraging people to go out there and play with this. The important thing is if one is able to identify the psilocybin mushrooms in one's backyard, and it could be the cure to depression, and the FDA and Johns Hopkins and UCLA and all these institutions, or maybe just you're cued into indigenous sacred healing practices, no one should be going to jail for that is the first
Exactly.
step. Beyond that, I mean, I'm very fascinated. What will this look like in terms of regulating and treatment? So Oregon is currently considering just full implementation. So if the current measure in Oregon passes, not only will they be decriminalized, but they will actually be integrated into therapeutic healing centers. I don't know all of the details
Interesting.
of their initiative. I do think that when we're deciding what role these substances could play in our society, one of the most instructive examples to think of, because this should be really critically thought through, is indigenous and traditional practices around these substances. And when you look at how entheogens or natural psychedelics have been used in societies throughout history, which they have, it goes back to Soma with the very early Hindus. The entire religion
Hmm.
of Hinduism is founded on this early basis of visionary poets taking an entheogen called Soma and seeing these visions through which they intuited facts about the world. A lot of religions, you can find that early on. In the American Southwest, it is perfectly legal for members of certain Native American tribes to ingest peyote, which is a sacred substance, which
Hmm.
we're not touching. Mescaline, the chemicals in a lot of cacti, which we want to decriminalize, but peyote is sacred to certain groups, so no one else should be messing with that. But it is integrated into their society into shamanistic rituals in the Amazon around ayahuasca or in Latin America. Also in Mexico, the Aztecs integrated psilocybin mushrooms into their practices, and the Spanish Catholics colonizers came in and brutally crushed the mushroom cult as they saw it. They did not understand it. But if you look at all of these societies, there are patterns you see in their use of these substances, one of which is they're highly controlled. It's usually a shaman or an elder figure, a wise figure, someone who has experience with these substances and with some sort of healing practices, who is the gatekeeper and distributes them. Often it is ritualistic. There's often maybe once a year or with a certain festival or with a certain, it is always very intentional. There's a cultural context that is done with the group. It is led by the figure such as the shaman. So there are just a lot of things we learn. These are not substances that societies have worked out ways to be using recreationally and casually. These are very important substances which have trained and experienced gatekeepers giving access to and guiding people through the experience of, which when you get into the science of it is so important because this is not like any other drug that we have integrated into our medical system. It's not just the Nixon administration being racist that
Right.
led to these societies, these drugs being made illegal. They're also weird. Every drug that we have in our medical system tends to work directly. It actually has a chemical effect, whereas these substances give you an experience. And And that experience is incredibly useful for mental health treatment. The example I like to use is in the 1950s, a lot of people in Hollywood were taking LSD. That's not covered in our initiative, but it has similar effects, so let's just use it as an example. People in Hollywood were taking LSD and chain smoking cigarettes. LSD doesn't make you stop craving nicotine, but psilocybin, very similar chemical, has been shown to be remarkably effective in smoking cessation, more effective than anything we've seen before. The difference is the people in those studies wanted to quit, and they were taking the substance in conjunction with cognitive therapy to
Right.
try to help them quit.
And there was
So
an intent.
it is the intention, it is the set and setting, the intention, the clinical setting. So in the 1950s, there were all these very positive studies around psychedelics, but then skeptics would try to replicate the studies in more laboratory-like conditions, and they wouldn't work because they were having subjects trip in sterile, scary white rooms, and they weren't being attentive to the set and setting. But they looked at the original studies where there might have been crystals and blankets and beads, and they were like, this isn't science, this is ridiculous. So how do you account for something as unscientific as the vibe of the
Right.
space?
Right.
It's difficult. It's going to take a lot of study, a lot of effort, and I do think that it's going to be best done when in conjunction with cognitive therapy and with trained therapists. So I don't know if that is treatment centers. I don't know how prescriptions will work there, but it's fascinating, and we need to figure it out.
Right. Yeah. I definitely understand what you're saying. I mean, I personally feel that there's, to some degree, I don't think we'll ever understand the true nature of psychedelics or the world around us. I mean, there's so many things that we just will never know, and I think that's just part of our biology. We're limited by that, by the capacity of our own biology to understand certain things. We can only think within the physical world, and we only have knowledge and acceptance of knowledge from the physical world. When we have something that's, as ethereal as a psychedelic experience, it's scary to many people because they just don't understand it. Some people run towards those things that they don't understand, those things that they want to find out, but know that there's probably a chance they'll never really understand it. I think that's an amazing thing about humans that has driven us throughout the centuries to get to where we are now. And I think that while we may never really truly understand them, it doesn't mean that they're not important. It doesn't mean that they're not helpful. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be trying to do this movement of trying to stop people from being arrested for just trying to heal themselves.
Yeah, I think that all rings true. I hope that the emerging science of consciousness will help us under. I hope that research around consciousness and research around psychedelics will go hand in hand, and they will both help us understand the other. So I do have some hopes there. I definitely think experientially what you say rings true, and that many people tried these drugs and they thought of them as just another street drug or
Right.
illegal drug. When we take things like opioids, intoxicants, entheogen, all these very different amphetamines, these very different drugs, and we just loop them together as these are all Schedule 1 drugs and they're the same. People tend to be reductive and think, oh, these are all similar. So people take a psychedelic and they don't know what to expect, and it may not be a great experience, but they can kind of just afterwards chalk it up to like, ooh, that was a drug experience. That was a weird 8 hours. I was really messed up. And they don't have any context to process maybe the trauma that actually did start to be unpacked
Right.
during that experience. Whereas when people understand what they're doing ahead of time, they know what these substances are, they're consciously choosing to go into this experience, they have a guide who knows what they're doing, they maybe had multiple sessions of therapy with that guide, both before and after. That's when the real potential here comes up. I think it's also interesting in the context of mindfulness meditation, which has received more and more coverage in the West recently, as people realize that you can actually see brain scans of the default mode network of the brain shutting down with experienced meditator. Like, oh, this is actually something that can be reflected scientifically. A lot of people report that psychedelics gave them the experience to believe in something outside the physical world, which sounds very supernatural, but just something like ego dissolution.
Right.
they experience ego dissolution through entheogens, and that led them to actually be willing to invest the time and energy on the really rough, long road of learning to meditate so that they could actually get there. Truly, some people liken a psychedelic is like strapping yourself to a rocket and aiming towards the tip of the mountain. And sometimes you get there and you get a free look at what it's like to be one with the universe, and that's very interesting. I think it's very different than actually hiking up the entire mountain, putting in that work. But some people don't believe in the mountain.
Right.
And so the rocket trip there for an afternoon, while chaotic and filled with distortion and not necessarily as useful, can even just be as simple as proof that there is something there, that you can lose the sense of self and still be there. Which obviously for a lot of people experiencing end of life anxiety or depression, alternatively, that single experience can actually relieve them of symptoms.
Right.
But even for many people who are well and not experiencing symptoms, it can be a motivation to actually put in the effort through real dedicated study, through something like mindfulness meditation, or even through prayer. I've encountered people through this campaign who have grown closer to their religious faiths and interpret their entheogenic experience through the language of their faith upbringing. And I think that's part of why, obviously, there's a huge amount of war on drugs baggage that comes with the term psychedelic, part of why we don't tend to use it. Though I think natural psychedelics is a good description for these substances. Our initiative does not cover LSD. If you synthesize and concentrate a chemical like DMT out of the plant, it's no longer covered. But I do think part of the reason we use the term entheogen is its root. It brings out the divine within. It gives you a spiritual experience. And you can be religious and believe in a metaphysical explanation for that experience. You are experiencing the glory of God at that moment. Or you can view it scientifically and think, wow, having the default mode network of the brain shut down for a few hours has a lot of cognitive benefits for these mental health therapy. And you can have your own opinion on how those explanations interact, whether they can both be true, but it's fascinating, definitely.
Yeah, it definitely is. Well, I think that's all the questions I have for you today. So thank you so much for taking the time to speak to me today. And you said you weren't an expert on any of this, but I mean, it seems like you know far more than I do about the intricacies of how this campaign is working, how these the regulations and all that might affect life in DC and culture in DC, and I think that the potential of decriminalizing and maybe in the future legalizing these substances is just limitless. I mean, there's so much potential here, even from a medical perspective. My fear, and you said something about this earlier, about like the potential of pharmaceutical companies patenting these molecules, which is a terrifying thought to someone who wants to use these to heal and to experience free thought. That's a terrifying thought. I mean, and I read a study that showed that scientists have now gene hacked E. coli bacteria to mass produce psilocybin in the lab. So there's definitely they're already working on this, and that was one of the things that was cited in the resources at the end of the FDA's page on why they're fast tracking psilocybin to be a new clinical area of research.
So that's fascinating. I actually wasn't aware of that. I'm going to have to look into it. I do think that I would hope that we get to a point in our society where we can balance the needs of modernization and globalization with the needs of integration with the earth and mental health and wellness. So I do really hope we get to a point where you can have companies producing synthetic psilocybin through genetically modified E. coli to supply these therapeutic centers with clinical grade psilocybin for psychedelic therapy and treatment. But at the same time, nobody's going to jail for gathering mushrooms locally and creating or growing at home through a growing medium, which is, very cheap and legal now.
It's also
and,
very sustainable.
Yeah, and highly sustainable. I had again I just hosted a panel on entheogens in the environment, and we had a few mycologists talking about different methods of mushroom production, and it's really fascinating. Fungi is actually closer related to animals than plants. So
Yep.
mushrooms produce carbon dioxide, unlike plants, which take it in. So you have to think about carbon offsets
Yeah.
with large scale mushroom. There are just so many factors there that we really need to think about. But I definitely hope that we can holistically both have some kind of mass production and availability without compromising the sustainability and the individual use and access that I think is really essential to avoid some of the issues we've run into with pharmaceutical drugs like SSRIs, all of these failed treatments for mental health issues, which address the symptom and not the disease. I don't think we should pretend that pharmaceuticals can't co-opt something like psychedelic drugs.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're already seeing with cannabis. That's very informative in itself. That in a lot of states, you have, such as Florida, you have the governor distributing a very small amount of cannabis licenses and distributing multiple to the same individuals, many of whom are donors or acquaintances. And so you have already this centralization of the market control into the hands of people who already are rich, already have the capital, were not systemically discriminated against in the war on drugs. And that's just tragic. Like, we need to, it's not enough to just fix the correction to end the war on drugs. We also need to address the past disparities, make sure that neighborhoods that were systemically targeted in the war on drugs are the first ones to benefit from its ending. A lot of things to think about, and just decriminalizing in DC is the first little step in a lot of things, such as changing our healthcare system to look at wellness, not just treating disease, to change our environmental system, to change our legal system and criminal justice system. This overlaps with a million things, and it's just a small step. But I really hope that we can keep on walking forwards.
Yeah, I do too. Well, thank you again so much, and
Thank you, Jacob.
have a great day. Enjoy next week coming up. I hope we have a good one.
Thank you. You too.
Yeah.
Please send me along the project when you're done. I'd love
I
to check
will.
it
I
out.
will. I'll definitely send it to you. Thank you
All
again.
right.
Have a
You
good
have a good
one.
one.